The night the student vanished smelled like old rain and warm asphalt. In the late summer of 1996, heat still lay low in the cornfields that flanked Route 17, and the neon vacancy sign at the Sunfield Motor Lodge stuttered like a breath held too long. Her name was Lila Hart, 21, a second-year linguistics major who loved taped lectures and underlined paperbacks and the kind of thrift store sweaters that looked borrowed from an older cousin. She had called her roommate from a payphone near mile marker 203 around dusk, swearing she would make it back to campus by morning if the ride held. When the radiator hissed at a service station and no bus came, she made the gentle, stubborn choice of the stranded and booked a room at the little roadside motel that had been there since 1959, its office paneled in orange wood and hand-lettered rules taped to the counter. The clerk remembered the sweater and the exact polite way she said thank you. That detail clung to the case for decades, useless in the heavy way useless details can be. By the end of that week, police cruisers had spent so many hours idling under the peeling eaves of the Sunfield that the paint wore darker where tailpipes breathed. Lila's bed showed a shallow trench where a light body had lain and then not lain. A paper cup on the nightstand left a ring that dried into an almost perfect halo. Two old women, both school bus drivers, told a deputy they had seen her earlier near the truck stop, talking to a long-haired hitchhiker with a canvas army pack, and that detail, the hitchhiker, stuck in a mouth like a seed husk. The county sheriff's office suspected him the way wind favors a low place, naturally, inevitably. But no one ever found him, not with any proof attached. The payphone swallowed its secrets. The ice machine shrugged. The asphalt forgot the markings of tires by morning. The night clerk, Denise, Bang's cigarette voice, a heart that got loud at the sight of missing posters, filled out the registration card with her familiar slant, the big easy D of her signature that looped like a lazy river. The motel used the stiff triplicate slips and a thick guest ledger to keep things proper, as the owner called it, because the credit card machine broke more often than it worked. In those days, motels still asked for license plates, and people still scrawled them with a mix of conscience and luck. Names could be fake, plates usually weren't. Still, the sheriff's deputy ran what little he had. Nothing held. By October, the case went to a folder and then to a box. Years passed, and the box took on the smell of all old cardboard, vanilla and dust, and Lila Hart became a photograph on bulletin boards and an anniversary news item 12 inches deep. The Sunfield Motor Lodge declined the way small places decline when highways change their minds. By the late 2000s, the 5 remaining units with functioning AC saw most of their guests arrive after midnight and leave before dawn. The old owner died of a quiet heart. The place went to his son, who sold it for the land. The motor lodge was knocked into a few memories and a generous pile of splinters. But the office lived in a shed for another year, a temporary fix that turned into an oversight, and in that shed, under a wobbling metal shelf, someone kept what no one needed, the old heavy guest ledger, warped from a long-ago roof leak, its pages swollen at the corners like a thumb that had been hit by a hammer. In 2021, a woman named Maya Klein bought the lot and the stubborn shed with it. Maya had grown up 3 counties over and had driven past the Sunfield Motor Lodge as a kid, watching the vacancy light flicker through her father's windshield like a blinking eye. She was 35 now and had stopped teaching to start over with something with edges she could touch. She planned a little roadside market, coffee, peaches, a rack with postcards that made the old look true again. When she cleaned the shed, the first thing she liked was the jar of key tags in faded red, each with a sunburst stamped over a number. The second thing was the ledger, because she liked old things that told the truth by mistake. The book weighed as much as a young cat. It carried dew in it, even when the air was dry. The cover said Sunfield Motor Lodge in white letters that had cracked into islands. The pages stuck together in humid clumps, and the handwriting within hopped from blocky to timid like different strangers speaking. Maya opened it with the kind of patience that comes from a lifetime of carefulness, page by page, seeing names from summers and winters 20, 30 years gone. She took photos with her phone, first for fun, then for a reason. A local history group on Facebook, full of people who remembered the old cafe with lemon pie or the bar with the bowling lanes, posted about lost places, and the old motel became a small reunion of memories in a comment thread full of the word remember. Someone linked to an article about the missing student from 1996. The name hit her in the chest, Lila Hart. Maya felt the ledger suddenly change from quaint to heavy. She posted a photograph of the page from late August 1996, where the registrations ran like a grocery list: Hensley, Benson, Hart, Lila's name there, neat, her address right down to the apartment number, the kind of care learned from rental agreements and bank tellers. Between Hart and the next entry, someone had pressed too hard with a pen. A groove ran through the paper. On the photograph, the groove looked like a hair. In the comments, a retired county librarian named Olga wrote, "Tilt the page under a light and dust with graphite. You can sometimes pull the indentations from pages above." Maya did not have graphite powder, but she had afternoon sunlight and a mind that liked small experiments. She brought the ledger to her new office, a rented container with a window, and set a lamp low and to the side. She slid a piece of black paper under the page to make faint things feel bold. She took another photo, then another, changing angles. The indentations rose and fell like pale topography. In one shot, the impressed curls of a name appeared in reverse above Lila's entry, like a ghost touching glass from the wrong side: H. Pierce. The P carried a sting in its tail that cut into the next line. The number 12 appeared in the margin with a dot by it, room number, or a clerk's shorthand that insisted on itself. Room 12 at the Sunfield Motor Lodge had once smelled of bleach and sun, and then, after the roof leak of '98, of old mops and shingle tar. The ledger told Maya that on the night Lila Hart vanished from that little roadside motel where police suspected a hitchhiker and had no evidence to catch him, there had been someone else on paper, one line above, whose registered name had been H. Pierce. Maya sent the photographs to the email address at the bottom of the old news article, ruth.pell@postmail. Ruth Pell had been the detective on the case once and had retired years earlier, the way old detectives retire, one eye always eavesdropping on the world. She wrote back within an hour to ask if the ledger was intact, if the corner torn 2 pages later was still missing, and if the stain by the March 1997 pages had ever looked like coffee or something else. Maya wrote back that the book had a warped spine and underlines made in violet highlighter here and there where all caps and no vacancy appeared, as if the clerk had wanted a visual shout. Ruth drove out the next morning, bringing with her a thin manila folder and a memory for very small things that had once mattered in quiet rooms where everyone had spoken halfway to whispering. Ruth touched the ledger like an old violin. She turned 3 pages forward, then back, murmuring room numbers like addresses to a city she knew in the dark. In 1996, the Sunfield had protocol: names, license plates, payment, initials by the rate. But Denise sometimes put notes in the margin, little codes, like a dot after a room number to indicate a walk-in paying cash. Ruth had not known the dot existed, or had forgotten, and the sight of it pried open a drawer in her head she had thought she nailed shut. A dot after room 12. A dot after 3. If there had been dots, then the guest had paid cash. If the guest had paid cash, the credit card slips would not exist. But the ledger's spine bulged strangely near the page with H. Pierce, and when Maya pressed on it, something gave in a soft little way. A strip of paper hidden in the spine, a fragment caught there during the merger of damp and time. The strip, once freed with tweezers and patience, showed a blind emboss and deboss, numbers pressed without ink by the old knucklebuster credit card machine that the motel had retired but sometimes still used when luck and electricity held hands. The raised numbers left a ghost like a footprint under snow. The digits were broken, partial, but there were enough, 4089 and the last 4 flattened into a smudge. Ruth called an old colleague who worked in fraud and who had a memory like a Rolodex. They traced nothing certain. They traced enough to know the card had belonged to a chain hardware store account that had switched hands in 1997 to a man whose address belonged to a mailbox service, the kind with 200 suites and 1 door. The man's name, Harold Pierce, with an I, though the ledger's impression suggested Pierce, with an A, and in the Morse code of tiny mistakes, that mattered. Ruth asked Maya for time and space and coffee. They brewed the good kind that tastes like attention and let the afternoon lengthen into a long gold ribbon. They photographed each page near August 29 and adjusted contrast like people squinting into old photographs to find cousins. The page right above Lila's line revealed something odder the longer you stared: a lowercase e that was always a little closed, a 7 that slashed itself with a faint crossbar, a habit of lifting the pen half a millimeter before finishing an R. Signatures often betray their owners by their habits. In 3 different motel pages in early September, they found the same E, the same slashed 7, the same shy R, and each time the registered name morphed: H. Pierce, H. Pierce, H. Pierce, all the variants you might pick if you were scattering dandelion seeds in the wind and hoping they never grew into anything. Each time, a dot followed the room number in the ledger margin. Police suspected the hitchhiker, Ruth said, eyes on the ledger, voice low. We suspected him because people said they saw her with a man who moved the way wind moves at truck stops. But I remembered the clerk talking about one other guy, a quiet one with a traveling salesman's box in the back seat. I filed it as nothing. We had no plate and no slip. Sometimes a whole life depends on which drawer a thing falls into. They had a fragment of a card number, a name with vowels trying on hats, and the ghost of a room. Maya found 3 of the old red key tags in the jar stamped 12 in white and laughed, a soft, disbelieving breath. She lined them up on the desk and imagined an August night with a moth pressing itself to the office window, Lila Hart's hand signing her name with the careful double-down strokes of someone who had learned to be precise, and a man with a quiet voice signing anything except himself. In the 2020s, small things became loud with the right attention. A craftsman's YouTube channel showed how to read ancient pencil marks by raking light. An archivist's blog explained how paper fibers hold on to pressure the way attic rafters hold heat. Maya bought a cheap USB microscope and held it over the ledger like a little spaceship. Threads of paper appeared like valleys and ridges. In the valleys, particles darker than paper. She adjusted focus and saw a dot where it should not be. Not the clerk's dot after the room number. A dot next to the letter P in Pierce. A dot that came from ink spatter. She followed it across the page to a comma in an address that did not belong to Lila's neat handwriting. H. Pierce's address had been a P.O. box in Macon County. That dot from the comma transferred by pressure to the indentation above Lila's name. The ledger had held on to punctuation the way people hold on to faces they glimpse once. They traced the P.O. box through old microfilm change of address records at the main post office where a woman named and had worked 4 decades and remembered when the sorting machine jammed every July 3rd because postcards clogged the line like carp in a narrow culvert. And let them look and then stood with them while they looked. Arms folded. In late 1996, the P.O. box had belonged to a company called Pierce Vending and Services, which installed soda machines in county buildings and paid cash for used ones. The company dissolved in 1998 when the owner moved on after personal matters. The owner of record by then had been Harold Pierce, who lived in a rented house with a garage the size of Confession. Vending, Maya said, trying the word on. It puts you everywhere without looking like you're anywhere. Ruth drove them by the old county annex where a row of soda machines stood like square, patient soldiers. The maintenance guy remembered nothing except a rumor that one of the men with a van and a dolly made better small talk than the rest and brought his own mop. Small talk lands the way handwriting lands, often the same even when the words change. When Ruth returned to her old manila folder, she found the long-ago list of tips and nothing burgers. One entry mentioned a brown Pontiac Transport van with rust around the rear wheel well seen at the Sunfield the week Lila disappeared. It had featured in 6 other tips that year: suspicious van, brown, possibly Pontiac, neon-tinted. No one loved the Pontiac Transport, it was shaped like a doorstop and beggared its own dignity. Harold Pierce had owned one in 1995 according to a lien filed on a repair bill that had found its way to collections and then to public record. The plate on the bill matched nothing now. In some state, somewhere, that van's number had been scraped off and reassigned to a fisherman who never knew he drove a ghost's name. In the shed behind Maya's container office, under a box of spigots, lay an old motel sign letter, the plastic kind you slid along a track to turn a dull sentence into a promise. It read weekly rates and the E was cracked at the middle bar. Maya propped it above the ledger like a stab of irony and turned another page forward, then backward, then forward again. The smallness of the clues exhausted and energized in equal measure. The digital photographs began to live their own life, layers adjusted, contrast tweaked, brightness pulled down until faded pencil came forward like a face stepping out of shadow. Tiny things kept happening. A line of 2 counts under a name, Denise's habit when someone asked for 2 towels. A circle around the 12 when someone asked for extra blankets. A smudge where a thumb once was, thick with the oils that outlast their owners. They found one more thing in the ledger that had never mattered until the 2020s made it matter. On August 29, someone had written 12, then erased it and written 9, and then written 12 again. A faint 9 sat under the 12 like a shadow, and to the side, in the margin, a small check. Denise had often checked off room keys returned at the end of a shift so she could sleep without the inventory rattling around her head. A check meant the key had come back. A circle around a number meant nothing as obvious. Maybe it meant someone wanted that room again tomorrow night and asked, or maybe Denise had used the circle to draw her own attention to something she only understood while she wrote it. Circles cling to meaning like burrs. You never get them all off your sleeve. News spread in the way news does in places where memory and land share a thin fence. A local reporter named Theo Navarro visited to take pictures of the peculiar ledger and talked with Ruth and Maya about what remained when buildings vanished. Theo wrote not like a breaking news person but like a person who kept a leather notebook, a man who liked the sound of his own pen. He mentioned the police suspicion of the hitchhiker and how that single image, the man with a pack, had steered attention for years the way a wind can nudge a boat toward the wrong cove. He wrote about the new owner who had digitized the old register and found in those digital enlargements a pattern as thin as dust that nevertheless held weight. He didn't call it a rebirth. He called it a repair. In a small ranch house on a street lined with low maples, a woman named Kara, once a roommate with a borrowed sweater, read Theo's article and felt the old hurt step out of its room. She had rebuilt her life around a certain quiet and had never found it. On nights she couldn't sleep, she had typed Lila's name with different misspellings into search engines, finding every time not her but a chorus of girls whose faces walked the same hall and then went missing along the same mile. She called Ruth on the burner number Ruth used to stay reachable and still free. She said she remembered a vending machine guy at their dorm who seemed to be there when no one else was. She remembered the oddity of his polite voice, a sound that wanted to be behind you. That detail, too small to be the spine of anything, returned to the box of smallnesses that the 2020s had made newly bright. Ruth requested the old motel's utility records through a public records clerk who remembered everyone's children by their nicknames. The month Lila vanished, the Sunfield had reported 2 service calls for the payphone by the office. The service notes listed dates and times. 17 minutes after Lila would have phoned her roommate, the technician logged out of the line with the note, static cleared, coin jam removed. The signature looked like it had been written while leaning on a truck hood, H, spiky, then a low run of letters, then a tail. The initials of the technician's company were PVS. Pierce Vending and Services used the same initials. It meant something and nothing, and so it meant more than it should. The county's cold case board convened in a bright room where an HVAC unit hummed like a living thing. On one wall hung a map with pushpins from 3 decades. Most meant a memory to one person and a line in a file to everyone else. The board decided to cross-reference Harold Pierce's van, work orders, and financial records from that hovering year. They found empties and shadows and the sort of half-trail a careful man leaves when he deals in cash and small talk. But they found, also, a receipt kept by a thrift store for the purchase of a motel dresser in 1999 out of a storage unit once rented by Pierce Vending and Services. The receipt had no address, but the storage unit had an auction notice in old newspaper microfilm that Ruth and Maya found on a machine that made a happy hungry noise when you fed it dimes. The auction had listed the contents in that carefully alluring way storage auctions do: dressers, mirror, nightstand, file cabinet, miscellaneous. Maya stood in the thrift store aisle between lamps that had lost their mates and dresses that had lost their decades and tried to taste the ghost of varnish. The owner, who collected fountain pens and old paperweights, had a basement with receipts in milk crates labeled in permanent marker. In the crate marked 1999, summer tasted like dust and vanilla gum wrappers, she found the copy of the dresser sale with an additional line that did not appear in public: metal box, contents unknown. The metal box had been locked. They had sold it with the dresser to a woman who paid in cash and who had squiggled a signature so hesitant it could have been anyone. The owner remembered the metal box only as something heavy and stubborn and the kind of thing that might hold sewing needles or old coins. If that had been the end of the road, no one would have been surprised. But the woman who bought the dresser returned a week later to exchange a lamp and told the clerk, who loved other people's errands more than anyone should, that the metal box had held nothing that mattered. The clerk, a thin man with a fondness for the scented pages in magazines, had written misc papers not worth in the margin of the sale copy because he liked margins to matter. He left his job that year, moved 2 towns over, and kept a stack of thrift store ephemera in a shoebox that ended up under his bed. 30 years later, when Theo the reporter visited to ask old employees about crates and receipts, the thin man smiled like a person who had finally been asked at the right time. He brought out the shoebox like a magician with the wrong trick and set it down carefully. Inside lay receipt copies, tag stubs, and one Polaroid of a dresser with a pale rectangular shadow on the top where something had once rested for a long time and then gone. The old dresser stood now in a house off State Route 15, in a bedroom with a wallpaper that made ivy of soft green lines. The woman who had bought it had died. Her daughter had put the contents of the house on Facebook Marketplace with 57 photos and the caption moving sale, everything must go. Ruth looked at the photos as if reading a diary written in furniture. The metal box sat on the dresser in one picture, finally not locked, a plain gray thing with a cheap clasp. It had no caption. In one zoom you could see a scatter of paper fanned under it like a crooked deck of cards. Among them, a card with a red sunburst pattern in the corner, the same sunburst as the motel key tags in Maya's jar. The Sunfield Motor Lodge had once stamped that sunburst on tip envelopes for housekeeping and on door hangers that begged for 10 more minutes to fix your hair. Maya messaged the seller with a courtesy and urgency and drove with Ruth to the ivy-walled house. They paid too much for the dresser and carried the metal box out like a person who might wake. On Maya's desk, under the same light that had made the ledger yield its ghostly loops, they opened the box. Inside lay an accordion folder with 2 broken rubber bands, a rolled stack of Polaroids like the bones of a paper animal, and, toward the bottom, a stiff pocket containing what looked like registration cards from 3 different motels, all with the corners cut in slightly different ways. The Sunfield's cards had 1 corner rounded and 3 square. The Drifting used 2 rounded corners because its owner liked the symmetry. The third had been the Bellcrest Motor Court, an hour west. On one Sunfield card, a name appeared in that same clumsy cursive with the shy R and the /7, H. Pierce. The license plate line read 7KQ4, 1, the missing digit filled with a line that could have been a 3 or an 8. 2 towels circled in pencil. Rate paid, cash. In another pocket lay a narrow strip of paper with numbers that meant nothing until they fell into place, dates, times, room numbers. It looked like someone had kept a private ledger of where he had been and when, as if alibis were better when they were made of paper. The dates ran across the week Lila had slept and then not slept at the Sunfield. Room 12 got a dot. Room 9 got a line, then a cross out. Room 12 again got a dot and a small check. The metal box smelled faintly of a raincoat. At the bottom lay a key tag, red, sunburst, without any number stamped in it, as if a blank wanted to be something and never had been. The pieces were too small and too many and yet somehow began to make a shape. Police who had once suspected the hitchhiker had suspected according to the time and to the tiredness of a story they had heard before. In the 2020s, when a new owner digitized the old motel registrations and turned faded ink and pressure marks into something readable, the case of the student who had vanished from a small roadside motel in the 90s shifted its weight. The key lived not in a confession or an eyewitness or a sudden discovery of bones. It lived in paper that had survived a leak, in indents a pen left when someone pressed too hard, in a dot after a room number that meant cash. It lived in a comma transferred by pressure. It lived in the accident of a ledger tucked into a shed and saved because a person who liked jars of keys also liked old books. The digital restorations made out of those photos, the contrast boosts, the angle changes, the tortured zooms, turned the small into a map of its own. Ruth sat back and closed her eyes and saw a sequence like a film without sound. Lila's careful name in blue. Denise's looping D. A man's weak E. A slashed 7. A dot that meant cash. Room 12. The hitchhiker memory fading a notch, not into nothing, but into a violent maybe. The vending van backing in under the stairs, motor ticking as it cooled. The bell at the office door going twice, too small sounds like a short sentence. She felt the old ache of what had not been seen when it could have been, the way people grieved in rooms without you. Theo wrote a second article and then a third. He found a woman in Macon County who used to date a man with a van who liked to pull the emery board from the glove compartment and smooth his nails while he talked. She remembered his R's. She remembered the way he corrected her once about the spelling of his own last name, Pierce like the ear, not the pear, and then signed a receipt with an anyway. She remembered the metal box, which he called his office, and how he never left it behind even when they were only going for an ice cream. She remembered him telling her once, not exactly bragging, that the thing about staying in motels was that the register rewarded the person who wrote with patience. In the station house, the cold case board put up side-by-side prints of the ledger photos and the registration cards from the metal box, the way teachers once taped math problems to chalkboards with conviction. They did not have a body. They did not have a confession. They had smallness arranged in a city of smallness, and that city had roads. They walked them. They filed requests. They revisited every witness who had said hitchhiker, and gently, with kindness, asked what they had really seen and what their memory had shaped into a man with a pack. One bus driver said she had always hated how her neighbor called every stranger a drifter. The other said the hitchhiker could have been someone with a lunch. A trucker who had stopped for a coffee at the Sunfield office that night said he had noticed a man in the hallway who smelled faintly of machine oil and cologne from the drugstore. He had not liked the way the man walked slower when he saw people. It had not seemed like anything. Now it seemed like a little something. And in the evenings, after the lights in the container office went warm and the daylight slid out of the fields like a sheet, Maya took more photos. She fed them into her modest laptop and watched as the software, cheap but eager, amplified what lived in the paper fibers. A pen lift. A micro scratch. A number written and then overwritten. She learned to see by subtraction, pulling light away until shape remained. The ledger became less a book and more a terrain. She and Ruth and Theo and, eventually, a detective 2 decades younger than the case stood around it like people around a campfire, listening to heat talk, waiting for the next small crack of something giving. Ruth returned to the crate of Sunfield odds and ends that Maya had been too sentimental to toss. On top lay the cracked plastic NO vacancy strip, beneath it a mouse-nibbled stack of carbon paper receipt sets, white, yellow, pink, bound by a dried rubber band that broke at a touch. Denise, the night clerk with the careful slant, had used those carbons when the knuckle-buster machine worked long enough to justify the effort. Many of the top sheets were blank to the naked eye, but when Maya angled her desk lamp and took high-resolution photos, the blanks weren't blank anymore. Faint block letters, a name in reverse because the top had been removed and the imprint persisted downward. In 3 sets dated within a week of Lila Hart's stay at that small roadside motel where police had suspected a hitchhiker and had no evidence, the same habits showed up again, the closed little e, the slashed 7, the r that lifted a breath too early. H. Pierce, H. Pierce, H. Pierce, each time paying cash, each time a dot after the room number in the ledger margin that Denise had probably added without a thought because small systems calmed her. Maya's laptop became a workbench for ghosts. She used nothing exotic, just the sort of image adjustments any school photo editor could manage, and pulled up contrast until the fibers of the carbon paper looked like winter fields. The pressure tracks from a ballpoint pen rose like faint roads. In one imprint, under where a license plate would have been, a sequence appeared with a distinctive loop on the 3 and a closed top on the 8. 7KQ4, 3 or 7KQ4, 8. The missing digit lived between those two shapes like a coin on edge. Ruth printed the imprints at poster size and taped them to the wall, then stood back with the posture of a person reading an altarpiece. Denise herself picked up on the second ring of a landline number scrounged from an old W-2 that the new county prosecutor had located in a storage binder with cracked rings. "Oh honey," she said when Ruth introduced herself. "That ledger is still around? I used to think it would outlive me." She remembered Lila. Everyone remembered Lila as if the motel had kept a smell of her and never released it. Denise remembered, too, a man with a soft voice who argued about a rate like he was reciting a recipe. He had a salesman's box in his back seat, she said, the sort with little compartments for wrenches, and a way of folding his receipts into quarters so sharp they could have cut paper. He had corrected her spelling of his last name once, then signed it a different way on the carbon. "People like that," she said, the cigarette in her voice thickening, "always corrected you for sport." "Did you keep any of your notebooks?" Ruth asked, and Denise laughed at the word as if it had just tried on a dress. She had kept one spiral pad because she used it to track cleaning rotations and lost and found after the Sunfield closed. The pad lived in a bottom drawer of a dresser that had stopped smelling like lavender the year her sister gave up ironing. When she found it and brought it to the table, the cover flaked blue like lake paint. Inside, on a page near the back, dated August 26 to September 3 in violet highlighter, a grid of room numbers ran left to right with X's and ticks and small circles. A tiny check by 12 on August 29. 2 dots in the corner of 12 for August 30, Denise's code 4, do not disturb requested. A margin note, 12, quiet man, second towel, later. The quiet man lived in her handwriting like a small animal burrowed in straw. The spiral paper had absorbed humidity and stories, and it, too, held pressure marks. Maya photographed the notebook at an angle so shallow the paper turned into a landscape. In the pressure shadow of the page above, she found a phone number written and then scribbled over, a series beginning 555-01, no good to anyone. But on the page below, a note, PVS called machine jam, H coming by. Denise had written PVS in block letters like a person transcribing from a voice that wanted to be precise. The vending men had been in and out all that week because the soda machine by the ice had eaten 3 quarters in a row. "We used to call them the van boys," Denise said, soft with the memory. "They always arrived with their own mop, which I appreciated until I did not." Ruth located the old payphone service logs that and at the post office said the telephone company kept on microfilm and then digitized badly sometime around the millennium. The digitizations were pixelated, the thermal fax headers looked like a snowstorm. But when Maya lowered the gamma, the header revealed just enough, August 29, 96, 2132, line clear, tech, HP. The initials were common enough to be almost a joke. The time matched the 17 minutes after Lila's call to her roommate. "If you wore another man's initials, we had irony," Theo said, and the joke sat lonely in the room and then went quiet. It turned out the county had bought piercings of soda machines at bulk auctions and never updated forms. It turned out the courthouse break room had a maintenance log that everyone ignored. In that log, Theo found signatures that veered between Pierce, and a tidy H. Pierce that looked like a printed name tag. Each H swooped in like a hawk, each R lifted early. The R became a door they could all walk through. Ruth photographed every R and pinned them on the wall until the slashed sevens looked like a tiny marching band. She wasn't a handwriting expert and didn't pretend to be, but habits had mass. Habits could lean a thing. The old Pontiac Trans Sport reappeared in a salvage yard inventory that a retired county clerk had preserved the way some people preserve wedding cake. The van had come in under a different plate in 1999, had been stripped of its seats by fall, and had left again as steel counted by weight. But the intake form listed something that made the room do that quiet bend when people recognize a turning, rear compartment, wood platform, custom cut, removable. A vending man often built such platforms for dollies and crates, said the yard's foreman when Ruth tracked him down for a cigarette and a memory. But the foreman added that this platform had been sealed with a rubberized paint that the yard boys called boat stuff, which was uncommon unless you wanted to keep spills from soaking into wood. "Folks do that when they haul paint or chemicals," he said, scratching a patch of eczema with the only key on his ring that didn't open anything anymore. "Or when they don't want stains to tell tales." The thrift store's metal box, the one that had ridden the dresser through time, held more tales than it had any right to. Under the registration cards and Polaroids, Maya found an index card with a grid drawn in with a ruler and pencil. Columns: room, rate, cash, CC, notes. Rows filled with numbers from a half-dozen motels: Bellcrest, Drift Inn, Sunfield, a place down by the river with no business keeping a name. Under notes, abbreviations that only the writer could have loved: T, TT, BL, HK. Denise leaned in and tapped with a nail painted a faded coral. T is towels, she said without hesitation. TT means double towels on request. BL is blankets. HK, housekeeping. That's our language, not his. The card showed that language mapped and used, someone else's shorthand turned into a private ledger. If the hitchhiker had haunted the edges of witness memory, the man with the van had haunted the edges of the motel's own grammar. Theo tracked down a woman named Val who had worked housekeeping with Denise that summer. Val's memory arrived in flashes like heat lightning. She remembered room 12 because of a ring on the nightstand that didn't belong to the room: dark, not quite coffee. She remembered Denise telling her to leave the do not disturb alone, even after checkout time, because the quiet man had paid for a late checkout, which he had insisted didn't mean housekeeping barges in to make the bed he planned to sleep in again. Most motels in that era had flimsy rules. Sunfield had Denise. Denise had rules like stitches. We used to enter with the hinge chain latched and call out, "Housekeeping," Val said. Sometimes men liked to startle you. This one never did. He talked in the hall, polite, like he was working a church bake sale. Maya began to think of the ledger and its associated scraps as an ecosystem. Digital restoration, such a grand phrase, mostly meant attention rendered pixel by pixel, contrast by contrast, until a comma moved forward in a field of fibers. It meant zooming past the point of decency and then zooming more, exhaling, and waiting for her eyes to adjust. On one of the Sunfield registration cards from the metal box, the faintest blue stamp mark bled into the card edge, half a sunburst, lined like a child's drawing of a shining star. The stamp bled only when Denise pressed too hard with the ink pad. The card showed the bleed. His pocket had kept her pressure forever. That made Maya's throat tighten in a way that felt like grief for an object. The police obtained a warrant to search the last known residence of Harold Pierce, which now belonged to a man who fixed antique radios and lived alone with 3 clocks that chimed off beat. The garage still smelled faintly of machine oil and raincoats. On a pegboard wall, someone long gone had drawn outlines of tools with a Sharpie, the ghost of a wrench, the ghost of a screwdriver, so he could put the things back in exactly the right place. In the corner, under a tarp that had grown stiff with dust, stood a dolly with rubber wheels glazed over. Its handle wrapped in black tape patched in neat overlaps. On the dolly's platform, a rust ghost had imprinted a rectangle the size of a metal box with a cheap clasp. A neighbor came by with baked bread the way some people come by with a curiosity. She said the man with the van had been helpful with trash cans and unpleasant with dogs. She remembered he had kept cans of talc in the garage, the kind swimmers used in locker rooms, because he disliked being sticky on the job. Talc in a garage sounded like nothing until Ruth remembered a training where an old CSI had explained how fine powders could pick out pressure trails against a page when you laid mylar and rubbed. They didn't have an electrostatic detection apparatus and no budget for clever toys, but the idea lingered. Maya spread a sheet of clear plastic over a ledger page that had resisted every digital trick, then dusted the air with a breath of cornstarch from the market's back room because talc wasn't in the pantry. She slid a soft cloth across the plastic, barely touching. The starch settled in waves. It collected, microscopically, where pressure had smoothed fibers. When she lifted the plastic, the page kept its secrets, but the plastic held the whisper of a name, an impression from the page, 2 above, that had never bled ink but had pressed hard, H. Pear, and then the tail of AC that looped like a practiced lie. They built a timeline on the whiteboard until the marker squeaked complaint. August 28, van seen at Sunfield, after 12. August 29, Lila checked in, payphone service call, tech HP signed off, after 12 again. August 30th, do not disturb in Denise's code, housekeeping notes of second towel. August 31st, carbon imprint of 12, paid cash, late. September 1st, nothing, except a receipt for gas 2 towns over in a card account that had bounced between 3 names and belonged to a hardware store credit chain. The smallness of it all made Theo write a line in his notebook that he later crossed out because it made him uncomfortable. The case had not been cold, we had simply forgotten how to feel the heat of tiny things. Kara, the old roommate, visited the container office at dusk when the peach baskets smelled like sugar and somebody's radio down the road hummed a country song about stubborn men and easy lies. She looked at the wall covered in blown-up ledger fragments and made a sound in her throat that belonged to a different room in a different year. She told them about a night when they had propped open their dorm room door during finals week for the breeze and watched a vending man restack sodas in the machine across the hall. He had moved cans like chess pieces. He had made a joke about the machine being thirsty. Lila had laughed and corrected a mispronunciation he made deliberately. She did that, Kara said, a smile and a wince. She thought language could make bad men harmless. Then her face changed as if someone dimmed a lamp, and she added that she had seen the same man months later, near the off-campus mail center, standing by the bulletin board that advertised tutoring and sublets and rideshares. She remembered his eyes first, how they went everywhere and nowhere, and then the way his hand hovered near the corner of a posted flyer as if it mattered to him that the paper be square. Themes swarmed the room, the small details, the small things, the digital restorations that taught all of them that even a flyer corner corrected 30 years ago could matter now. Ruth located a trove of county property inspection photos from 1997, taken by a deputy with an artsy streak and poor depth perception. In one of the photographs, blurry, sun at the wrong angle, a brown Pontiac Trans Sport van sat in the background of a code violation shot for a peeling fence. On its dashboard, something white and rectangular lay at an angle. Maya pushed pixels until the rectangle yielded nothing but whiteness. But in the van's window, an air freshener hung in the shape of a pine tree, the cheap kind. It meant nothing until Denise said, "He always smelled like the wrong pine," and they all laughed because the wrong pine was suddenly the most precise phrase anyone had used all week. A younger detective on the cold case team, name of Bell, wore his hair in a way television likes and owned a flatbed scanner that could take oversized pages without complaining. He scanned the ledger at ultra-high DPI because he believed in drowning problems in resolution. In the scan of the August 29th page, something hid within the paper grain, a faint straight line, not a fiber, not a pen stroke, a rule from one of Denise's old plastic forms that had been placed beneath the ledger as she wrote. The rule had a tiny manufacturer's mark at the end. Wycombe Form CO. Bell Googled it with the delight of a man who liked typing and found that the company had sold specialized motel slips nationwide in the 1980s and 1990s, each with minute layout quirks. The Sunfields form used a 3mm offset between the license plate and vehicle make fields, the Bellcrests used 4. Those offsets matched the spacing in the carbon imprints found in the metal box. It wasn't cinematic. It was precise. It bound the registration card fragments to the Sunfield, not merely to a generic motel. One Polaroid from the metal box showed a hallway that wanted to be anywhere. The carpet wore a pattern of small squares, the baseboard had a scuff shaped like a comma, the door numbers were the stick-on brass kind with a little serif. Maya brought up a photograph from an old real estate flyer that Denise had saved, Sunfield Motor Lodge, renovated 1989. The same carpet squares marched down the hallway. The same comma-shaped scuff appeared in reverse on the mirrored half of the picture, because the flyer had flipped the image to make the hallway look longer. When they overlaid the Polaroid and the flyer in the computer, the scuff aligned with the scuff. Harold's camera had been pointed down Sunfield's hallway. His metal box had held the proof he had accidentally made for his own undoing and then kept because his mind loved order more than it feared memory. Night slid in and took the edges off everything. The market closed. The road took on the slow sound of less. Maya brewed more coffee that tasted like resolve. Ruth called the county attorney from the parking lot and spoke in low sentences that carried 30 years. Theo texted his editor a photo of the ledger page with the slashed sevens because sometimes a single character said more than a paragraph did. And in the soft hour when fields breathe and insects take over the choir, Kara sat with Maya and spoke quietly about Lila's mother, who had stopped coming to campus vigils after the third year because sometimes not being asked to remember is a gift no one offers. She told me once, Kara said, that what killed her wasn't not knowing where Lila was. It was not knowing when the last ordinary thing had happened. Was it the payphone? Was it the stamp on the registration card? Was it the moment she put her toothbrush in a motel cup? She wanted to memorialize the last regular thing and couldn't. The next small regular thing arrived in a brown envelope no one had expected. The thrift store owner with the fountain pens found, tucked in a pen display he hadn't used since the year the Sunfield closed, a handful of motel door hangers with the red sunburst, "Please make up room on one side, do not disturb on the other." On one hanger, pressed into the cardboard as if someone had once leaned hard while writing on it over the motel desk, lived a series of numbers that looked like a date and a time, August 29, 10:11 p.m. Under it, a word. The word had lost its vowels to pressure and time, but the consonants remained, CHCKD. Checked, Ruth said immediately. He made himself a list on whatever was in front of him. Denise frowned at the hanger like a mother at an unruly child. "Those were supposed to stay on doors," she said softly, and then put her hand on the ridged word as if it were warm. They found another hanger with a name, a first name, impressed into it at an angle. It wasn't Lila's, it was Denise, the D big and river looped, the I dotted with a heavy point that had driven through to the table beneath. He had written over her name while using the hanger as a pad. He had pressed her name into a thing, and then kept that thing. The wrongness of that little theft pooled in the room like cold air. It told a story of a man who harvested details, not for profit, not even for function, but for the sensation of control they gave him. Vending routes, motel slips, door hangers, towel codes. He collected the grammar of small places in order to move through them like a native. Bell found a decades-old pager record in an evidence log from a different case that had never touched Sunfield's box, an entry for a contact number left by H. Pierce, vending, with a numeric code that only the caller would have understood. The pager service had long ago died. But the numeric code, when inverted the way vending men sometimes inverted to keep customers from abusing a number, spelled 1212. Room 12 in Denise's language. A coincidence, maybe. A thread, surely. Threads in their thousands make rope. Ruth, who wore fatigue well but not endlessly, walked them through a gentle, methodical re-interview of the two bus drivers who had launched the hitchhiker suspicion in 1996. The first remembered the canvas pack and the hair, yes, and the way she and her friend had turned that sight into a man because it fit what everyone said in those years when girls went missing and men with packs haunted every cautionary tale. The second admitted, with the sort of courage that tastes like medicine, that the person might have been a woman with a duffel. "We made him into a drifter so we could name the fear," she said. The cold case board did not edit the past, it let the past tell on itself. The hitchhiker did not vanish, he shrank into his actual size. The small roadside motel remained. The missing student remained. The police suspicion remained, but it loosened, its grip softened by better light. Maya, always with the camera, discovered that if she printed two versions of the ledger page, one at normal contrast, one at hateful, blinding contrast, and layered them, the dither between them made the eye pick up patterns it would otherwise miss. Through that flicker, the dotted after-room marks became as loud as bells. On one page, a dot that wasn't a dot but a flake of Denise's violet highlighter, displaced. That flake had texture under the USB microscope, it glittered like mica. And just beside that glitter, a hairline scratch, too straight to be an accident, aligned with the same scratch on the metal box's index card. The scratch had come from a ruler with a nick in it. Whoever had drawn the index card's grid had used the same nicked ruler that had sat on Denise's desk, because Denise, thrifty and endearing, had loaned it to motel men who wanted to straighten out their forms. She remembered the request now, the way that sort of memory returns when given a place to land. She had handed over her staff ruler, Wycombe Form CO, printed at the end, and never gotten it back. Digital restoration, Theo wrote in his third piece that week, did not resurrect a ghost. It revealed the fingerprints of people who never intended to leave any. A comma pressed through a page. A dot denoting cash. A ruler's tiny nick doing cartography on a grid 30 years later. The mystery, it turned out, lived not in grand confessions but in the way a clerk's habits and a salesman's hunger for control bumped into each other on a counter under fluorescent light. He filed that paragraph and then underlined fluorescent light twice because he liked the image of that old office glow, the hum like a patient bee, the way fluorescence flattened everyone and everything into the same tone. On a Tuesday that felt like a Friday because the air went soft and the sky decided not to bark, Kara brought Lila's old cassette recorder to Maya's office. It had a crack near the battery hatch and a sticker of a moon curling up at the edges. In the compartment, an unlabeled tape had waited for decades. Kara had once used it to play Lila's linguistics lectures to fall asleep. She had tucked it away when sleep became a thing that refused tucking. The recorder balked at first, then played tinny voices and classroom coughs. Midway through a tape, there was a rattle, something jostled on a table in 1996, a man's voice at the edge of the room asking if he could leave a flyer on the bulletin board. His voice carried too crisply for a man standing outside a doorway. He said Pierce once and Pierce the next sentence. He said check with the hard K of a person who liked to land words. In the background, a student had laughed at nothing, and then the lecture resumed. It wasn't evidence that closed a door. It was a draft that made everyone in the room look the same direction. They catalogued the smallness. They let the smallness pile into a mass. The small roadside motel from the 90s came back to life in fragments, the ring on the nightstand, the violet highlighter, the dot for cash, the door hanger pressed with the wrong man's list, the ledger that had survived a roof leak and a sale and a shed because a new owner in the 2020s liked jars of keys and had a mind for what could be saved. The student who vanished, Lila Hart, stood not just in photos but in the way she wrote her address down to the apartment number and corrected a mispronunciation because words mattered to her. The police suspicion that had pointed toward a hitchhiker kept returning like a tide and then pulling back a little more with each tide, leaving the gravel of other truths exposed. They still didn't have the last ordinary thing. They might never. But on a late evening, when the peach baskets had been emptied and the neon vacancy that Maya had bought at an estate sale hung in her office window as a joke that hurt and comforted, Denise brought a small square of paper she had found in the bottom of an old cash drawer. It had once been a sticky note. The adhesive had died in 1999. On it, written in the quick hand of someone interrupted twice, were the words, 12 asks for late, pay cash, clean AM. The time scribbled at the bottom read 10:06 p.m. The 6 looked like AB with its head shaved. In the upper corner, where the paper had peeled from a stack, dust had settled in a shape like a thumb. Maya took a picture of the dust and laughed, a helpless, human little sound, because she had never imagined taking a picture of dust could feel like a victory. Ruth, who had seen victories that looked like broken men and losses that looked like polished plaques, put her hand on the ledger and let it sit there. The pages had warmed under all these hands. Paper does that, it carries the heat of attention. We built a case out of commas, she said, and nobody contradicted her. Outside, trucks went by, slower here than on the interstate, their brakes sighing like tired horses. The market sign flickered. The night held. Somewhere down the road, a vending machine hummed under a fluorescent light, doing the small good work of being reliable in a place that had not been. And in the office that had become half shrine, half lab, the digitized registrations glowed on the screen as if the 2020s had handed the 1990s a flashlight and told them, gently, where to point it. The last ordinary thing hid in a place so small no one had thought to look twice. Belle scanned the back cover of the ledger because the cardboard felt thicker there, and the scan revealed a faint rectangular void, adhesive shadow where something once lay and then did not. Denise squinted, then snapped her fingers. She had sometimes tucked hold items there, plates, numbers on scraps, unpaid balances on post-its, until she could move them to a proper form. Maya slid a fingernail under the frayed cloth at the bottom edge and felt the give of old glue. A narrow envelope came free with a papery sigh. Inside lay a single motel registration correction slip, a thin strip that clerks used when a guest changed rooms. The slip, dated August 29, 96, bore Denise's slanted hand at the top, 9/12. Beneath it, written in a different, precise hand, the one with the shy R and the slashed 7, a line read, H. Pierce, 2 towels, followed by a plate written more carefully than any on the main card, 7KQ4B3. The missing digit chose a shape. The B wasn't an 8. It sat there with its little belly and its backbone, a letter, not a number. Denise exhaled as if someone had opened a window in a crowded room. I must have stuck it there until I copied it over, she said, grief and pride braided in her voice. Then I forgot to copy it over. The plate landed like an anchor. Records from a neighboring state tied 7KQ4B3 to a brown Pontiac Transport registered to a Harold Benton Pierce, Macon County, active through late 1997. Insurance records noted a minor rear-end collision in September of that year. The claim listed work done to the rear bumper and a repaint. A mechanic, now retired to a porch and a dog and a stubborn tomato patch, remembered the van because its owner had insisted on watching the repaint through the glass and had asked if the shop salvaged the masking paper when it was still clean. He didn't like waste, the mechanic said, then added, he didn't like fingerprints either, because the man had wiped the inside of the van's rear hatch with a rag while the paint cured. The county attorney's voice turned careful when the plate clicked into place with the ledger impressions, the door hangers, the metal box, the ruler nick. A judge signed a warrant for a deeper search of Pierce's old storage unit records. And a second thrift owner produced a forgotten crate from a mezzanine labeled office junk, 1998, that had been too dull to sell. Inside lay spiral pads with vendor notes, mileage logs, and a stack of motel housekeeping envelopes with the Sunfield's red sunburst stamped in the corner. On 3 envelopes, a name appeared in small, careful block letters, H. Pierce, and a room number below, 12. One envelope held 3 $1 bills and, stuck to the paper with the tacky residue time leaves behind, a small, triangular tear from the corner of a motel registration card. The tear matched the corner of the Sunfield card in the metal box like a broken seashell finding its other half. They drove the fragments as far as they could go. Pierce had moved in 1998, then again in 2001, then had died in 2009 of a quiet heart in a different county whose clerk answered questions with sympathy and folders. There was no confession folded in a Bible, no marked map buried in a yard. There was a life that had wandered from soda machines to small motels to storage units and had kept the paper grammar of those places as if it were treasure. The state's cold case team assembled the ledger scans, the correction slip, the plate, the van salvage note about the rubberized platform, the payphone log with tech, HP, the pager numeric code for 1212, the Polaroid of the Sunfield hallway with the comma-shaped scuff, the door hangers impressed with CHCKD and Denise, the index card grid with a nicked ruler that matched the scratch in the ledger page, and the correction slip that Denise had tucked and forgotten. In a conference room that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old coffee, they laid it all out in a sequence that made an ordinary cruelty legible. The board voted to clear the case by exception and to name Harold Benton Pierce as the person responsible for the disappearance of Lila Hart at the Sunfield Motor Lodge in late August of 1996. The announcement came on a day with smart, decent sunlight. The sheriff read from a prepared statement, his voice steady. He named the hitchhiker for what he had always been in this story, a silhouette of rumor and fear, an image that had led good people down a long detour. He named the small roadside motel for what it had been, an intersection of habits and papers and a clerk's dots that, in the 2020s, became legible when digitized and seen at the right angle. He named Lila for who she had been, a second-year linguistics major who loved taped lectures and thrift store sweaters and precise addresses and the belief that language could make men gentler. Kara stood at the back near the door as if ready to leave and unable to. When it ended, she walked with Ruth and Maya across the square to the little coffee place that always smelled like cinnamon because someone overshook a shaker on opening day and decided that would be their thing. She sat with them and held the old cassette recorder on the table, the moon sticker curled up at the edges. She pressed play and let Lila's lecture roll for a minute, the murmur of past classroom air filling present room air. At the part where the vending man asked about the flyer, Kara pressed stop and then rewind, then stop again, then leave it there. I hated the last 30 years, she said, raw and exact. This didn't fix them. But it stopped them from rolling forward. Theo wrote the piece that closed his own loop. He did not glorify a man whose life had been a collection of other people's smallnesses. He wrote about the ledger that survived a roof leak and a demolition and a shed, then met a new owner who liked jars of keys and decided to digitize a book because the pages felt like stored weather. He wrote about Denise's dots and checks, about the comma pressed through a page, about the door hangers used as scrap, about a slashed 7 and a shy R and a ruler's nick, about a plate that pretended to be a number until it showed its letter, about cornstarch and a sheet of plastic making an impression breathe. He wrote that a case closed by exception might look cold on paper, but not when the paper itself had done the warming. They held a small gathering at the lot where the sunfield had once lived its faded, fluorescent life. The market's awning shaded a folding table. Peaches sat in bowls. Maya set the ledger, now sleeved in a clear archival cover, on a stand. Denise wore a neat blouse and pinned her hair with an old barrette that remembered the 1980s with unnecessary enthusiasm. The county erected a simple plaque on a post near where the office had stood. It did not name the man. It named the woman. It read, "In memory of Lila Hart. 1996. Some answers arrived when light found paper. Small things decided everything. Kara spoke, not long, and not loudly. She said that the last ordinary thing need not be known to be honored. It could be any kindness we did without thinking, any exactness we practiced because it helped our neighbors, any dot we put after a number because it calmed us. She said that Denise's dots, which had never expected to carry anything, had carried all this way. Denise cried in the private way practiced women do, hand to cheek, eyes bright, chin set. After the people left and the field went back to insects and low wind, Maya sat alone with the ledger and flipped to the August page one more time. The photos she had taken lived in folders with names that had started as jokes and turned into landmarks: dust that matters, dots that count, nicked ruler, slashed 7s, door hangers talk. She scrolled through them and felt the odd holiness that attention can become. On her desk sat the red key tags with the sunburst. She lined them up, 10, 11, 12, and turned the 12 over in her palm. The little white number had chipped at the edge, just enough to make a crescent. She took a picture of the chip because now she took pictures of everything that looked like a sentence, and then she set the tag back in the jar. Ruth retired again in the way only people who have retired twice understand. She kept a copy of the ledger scans on a thumb drive and labeled it, in her neat blocky hand, Sunfield/Lila/paper. She mailed a second copy to a former student of hers who taught a class on forensics at the community college, along with a note: teach them the comma. Teach them the dot. Teach them the ruler. Teach them that digital restoration is not magic, it is respect. The lot grew a little, a string of market lights, a bench that came from a churchyard sale, a new trash can that made the raccoons work for it. People stopped on their way to somewhere else and bought peaches and coffee and, sometimes, a postcard that carried a photograph of the ledger's August page, artfully cropped so it looked like a coastline. A few read the plaque. A few didn't. The road moved on the way roads do. Trucks sighed. Moths came to the lights and insisted. Kara visited every now and then and sat on the bench and listened to nothing in particular. She brought the cassette player once more and left it with Maya, who put it in a glass case by the ledger, the little moon sticker facing out. Denise came by with her spiral, the cover still flaking like lake paint, and let Maya photocopy the page with the grid because she liked the idea that her codes might become someone else's rescue one day, in a different place, for a different person. When the season turned and the market sold cider instead of peaches, the sky lowered and the fields changed their green. Maya locked up one night and looked back through the window at the ledger on its stand, the glowing scans on the monitor, the jar of key tags with their faded sunbursts. The room felt full and quiet. She thought of how the 1990s had left small impressions in paper, and how the 2020s had given those impressions a place to speak. She thought of how, in a world that loved headlines, this had been solved by footnotes. The neon vacancy sign she had hung in the office window because it felt right and wrong at once hummed softly. Its letters flickered and steadied. She turned it off and watched the afterglow. Down the road, beyond the bend where the sunfield once stood, a vending machine in someone's break room hummed its dependable hum, and a clerk somewhere made a dot after a number because small systems calmed her. Lila's name, neat on paper, lived in the ledger, in its sleeve and in the scans, and in the plaque. And in the way strangers now paid more attention to commas. The case had ended not with the clang of a cell door, but with a door hanger pressed into cardboard